I'd like to ask you a few questions before we get into the questions that were posed by the audience. Can you talk about sourcing capital? So I think this is, how you do it if you know where to find money or if you have found money. Can you talk about how one might source capital?
Sure. I think for most entrepreneurial stories, it's everywhere and everything. You have to take what you can, and you're going to do everything you can. So you're talking to your friends. You're going to hire people to do it for you. In marijuana, I think you have a unique situation where it's high growth. Frankly, this program is really exciting. This is a really exciting market, and so there will be a lot of investors out there. I think the easiest way to connect with investors in this particular setting is about making sure that you are out and about in the space, so you're talking to people and you're connecting with people and they know that you're looking for capital, right? Like for example, you may not meet me, but you will probably meet someone who knows me, and if someone like you, Amy, right? And they say, oh, I'm looking for capital. Amy's like, hey, there's this guy Chi, he's okay, he's interested in this space, you should probably meet. A lot of marijuana investing is through networking. There are brokers, there are official brokers who will go out and help you raise capital, but there are also, I think, a lot of informal networks of people, and they're forums for you to get this out there, right? So when you talk about your business and your plans, people like me are there looking around and hoping to find people like you. Does that answer that question?
I think it does. I wonder, for the winners of these social equity licenses, are you recommending attending conferences? Are you recommending, joining some of these organizations? Like, what is a good way, if you've never gone out and raised money and you didn't kind of start in this space early on, are there some key things that would be good to do to bridge that? And I think the follow-up question to that is, I think people watching probably are wondering, is there good capital available?
So let's talk about this process in particular. Right, there's going to be 169 licenses or so in the state of Arizona. This process is for 26 of them, so that's 15% of the market. My point being, these are going to be very desirable. I think there will be people looking to make investments and to find ways to support entrepreneurs and partner with them. So I think there will be a lot of capital. There will be lots of capital. Again, the key is not going to be, I think, necessarily finding capital. It's going to be discerning capital, finding out which are the predatory people, which are the people who are, there's a saying, loan to own, right? They're not really helping you. But then there are also going to be good partners. And then I'd say even further criteria, finding the right partner for you in your given situation, right? So I think there's going to be a fair amount of capital in this space. It's an attractive space. In terms of actually getting access to it, here's the reality. If again, I don't know, I don't have any insight into how the state will do it, but the previous, if you've been following, the most recent lottery processes, the winners are announced. And if you attend a conference, there will be conferences and there will be events, I think, catering to helping people do that, to help them raise money to figure out how to get their business going, right? Because marijuana is not easy, right? 10,000 feet, it's easy, but there's a lot of things that you have to do, and it's highly regulated. So to that end, I think it's also really, going back to that point, finding advisors is really important. Mm-hmm. So whether it's an attorney that you trust, whether it's talking to your accountant, whether it's talking to someone who's in the industry, right? You're probably going to want to do a fair amount of networking anyway, just to meet people. The best way to learn about how to solve problems is to talk to other people who've been through it. I'll speak for myself. I found the marijuana industry in every state has been fairly congenial and collaborative, right? It's not competitive, because in most of these markets, it's it's you against the world, right? It's you against the machine. Take Arizona. There's only going to be 169 licenses, right? It may be extremely competitive to win a license, but once you're in that circle, everyone has much bigger problems, right? They have to figure out how to navigate this brand new, fast growing, highly regulated industry, and they're going to be talking to each other. So in that regard, I would encourage all entrepreneurs, if anyone is lucky enough to win one of these, get out there in the marketplace, talk to other people, talk to advisors, and there will be events, I'm sure, and attend a few events, and you get a feel for what works for you.
You talked about advisory boards, and I think that's something really important on the fundraising side. I mean, on the growth side and the management side, those things are important too. But on the fundraising side, will you talk a little bit about who should populate an advisory board other than like maybe your best friend, maybe never your best friend? Who should populate them, and how can you utilize an advisory board as part of your fundraising process?
I think of when there's different ways to populate an advisory board, and I'll use a very basic framework, right? One is what you alluded to, people you trust and that will be there forever and may not know what they're talking about, but always have your back, right? That's one approach. And then the other approach is to say, hey, who is really good at doing the various different things? So who's been through this, who's seen this rodeo before? Who has connections to capital? Who has operated this business and knows what are the things that are important to talk about and aren't important to talk about? Who are the people who know a lot of who can negotiate that and have been through a lot of documentation? So there's two approaches. One is to get advisors that you trust implicitly, who may not have the skill set, and then the other side is to find people who have expertise in that exact area, right? Often it's who has access to capital, right? Often it's going to be someone who knows a lot of really rich people or who hangs out in those circles, or it's going to be a lawyer who caters to those type of clientele or services that space. There is a wide range of things that you can do to put together an advisory board, whether formal or informal. Those are the two basic approaches. I often think for an early stage company, you need a little of both, right? You need the people who are in your corner regardless and who are always going to be looking out for you. And then you need people who actually know who have some experience. And here's the thing with advisory boards. In a perfect world, you have an advisor who grows with you, who's seen it from start to finish and soup to nuts, and as well has done all these activities. Raised money, had a bad investor, figured it out, has done that, and they're the perfect advisor. The reality is not many of us have done that, have done everything from cradle to grave for a business. And so you can't be afraid of changing advisors, right? The most important thing, it comes down to it, advisor is there for you. So if an advisor is not helping you out, I mean, they can be helping you out and giving you credibility. They can be helping you out. There's a lot of ways of helping you out. But at the end of the day, if they're not helping you out, you're probably not the right advisor.
Before we move on to the questions that have been asked, my final question is to talk some about how important having a management team is when you're going out and fundraising.
So going back to that framework where we talked about putting your vision out, communicating your vision, fundraising, and then negotiation. To me, when you're talking about that vision, if it's a one-person show and you're putting out that vision, but here's the reality: marijuana it's a complex industry, and it takes a lot of skills. It takes a lot of nuanced skills, and if I'm investing, going back to that second item, right? So the first one was, are you excited about the space? The second is, do I believe your projections? Do I believe your vision? And the third is, do I believe in you? Going to that second one, if we're saying this is where your business is today and this is where your business is going, you're trying your best to help your investor believe that you can get there. And one of the best ways to do it is actually having a great management team, having people who you already understand. To me, having a great management team reflects a lot. It reflects, I understand how my business is going to be organized. I understand what the challenges are. And I went out and found people that are experts at that and can do that. And they agree with my vision. And so think of it from an investor's point of view, the more you see of a management team, the more baked it is and the more thoughtful it is, it's a sign. It's a sign, other people agree with this. There's less chance that they're going to fail, more chance that they're going to succeed. And that's what a management team's for. Now, some investors are going to come in and they're, especially angels or some of the larger funds, they're going to come in and they have a very specific thing. Oh, this is how we do it, and we're going to help you do that. Let's be clear. No investor is in your seat. This is your business. You're running it day to day. I'm like a nosy investor, and I talk to my entrepreneurs like once every 2 weeks, and I'm a nosy one. Like a lot of investors only talk to their portfolio partners like once a quarter, if that. So anyone who very rarely when an investor says I'm going to come in and I'll take care of this. Again, sometimes they do, but by and large, your investors are people who will assess the situation, put capital in, and then call you periodically. So your management team is what's going to help you succeed. They're going to be the ones that really help you achieve those building blocks.
I'm going to switch to some of the questions posed by the attendees, and I'm going to start at the top and make my way down to the bottom. The question as posed is, when you go ask for money from an investor, what percentage do you give away in comparison to the value of the company? So I think that another way to ask that is, how do you decide your valuation, especially if you're doing an, I think, early stage equity raise?
Well, I think if Shark Tank has taught us anything, you just go in with a number. So yeah, exactly what you said. What you're doing is you're saying this is how much it's worth, and this is how much I'm trying to how much money I want to take, right? Let's go back to that question, that concept of sources and uses, right? In a perfect world, you're like, great, I just want lots of money and I want it to be cheap and sweet. Realistically, that money, as we talked about, is going to be expensive, right? So you want to know how much money you're taking. You don't want to take unlimited amounts of money. You want a very specific amount. And your investor should want you to take a limited amount, and your investor should want you to say, I know what I'm spending it on, right? If you're like, I'm going to spend it on balloons, that's not a good answer. If you're saying, I'm going to spend this much on equipment, this much on staffing, this much on rent, and this much on marketing. And you'll have a budget presentation, there's another module, but the more detailed you can give on that, the more detail you give there, I think the more comfort an investor has. But that process also serves to help you understand how much money you want to take. And so you're trying to figure out that trade-off of what your business is worth and how much money you want to take. All things being equal, you would say, I want to take as little money as possible and my value of my company is as high as possible. The reality is, and I actually do think this will be the case for the Arizona marijuana market, there are going to be different values put out there, and there are going to be different deals posed, and there will be a market, right? And someone's going to say, your business is worth this. Oh, you've got a management team and a location set out, and you've got actual operating experience. Okay, your business is worth this. And then you're going back to that math, pre-money, how much you're taking, post-money, and then that's how you figure out the ownership. It's hard when you're doing a startup, right? When you're just starting and you don't have anything except for a license, a piece of paper, and it's hard to assign a value. And that's why often your first capital comes from friends and family, because the idea is friends and family, they're not there to make money. They're not there to squeeze the best deal out of you, right? They're just there to back you. And so usually friends and family, I like to say they're less valuation sensitive, right? It's whatever you decide, they're like, sweet, we'll do it, because we like you. I wish there were a lot more science to this, but there is a lot of art. The science is really just people use calculators when they're calculating it, but the approach is still the same, right? It's either a market or there's a sentiment of what your business is worth and what you're asking for and how achievable is it.
Can you direct people to where they might go if you are, let's say you win a license and you're set to open your dispensary and you're trying to figure out, what your valuation should be? Where can people look, or what resources can they go to? We've had a couple questions mixed in here about, how do you raise money without giving away the entire business? So where can you go to figure out kind of a justifiable and defendable valuation in this market? I know Arizona has had some sales. Like, where can people start there?
So I'd start by reading things in the industry, right? So the standard trade pieces. There's something called MJ Biz Daily. It's a daily email, and they have on their website, and they update its daily paper periodical. There are a couple of industry magazines out there, Cannabis Times. To be honest, I read so many things I don't remember any of them. It's hard. It's hard to gauge where it is. I think the best thing to do is go out and get as many data points as you can. There's no Redfin or Zillow, unfortunately, in this space. But I think reading, as you mentioned, Amy, finding some of those other comparable transactions, right? So you'll read through MJ Biz, and you can search for Arizona licenses, sales, and they'll have some of those stories. There's a few investment banks that publish regular materials. So there's not endorsing any of these groups, but I'm just thinking some of the things. There's a Canadian bank called Beacon, which publishes daily comps. There's a bank here in the U.S. called Veridian, and they publish a lot of comps, comparable transactions, right? So just like if you're looking for a house and you're trying to see what else is sold, a few of these banks will publish them. And so really just, you go to Google investment bank cannabis, you'll get, there's probably a list of 10 only right now. It's actually not that deep. You'll find these 10 firms, and they'll have a newsletter, they'll write about things, and a lot of them will publish sort of the comparable tables of how other companies have been valued, whether private transactions or how publics are valued. This industry is a little funny. Right now, the publics are all valued substantially more than the privates, just because investors are a little skittish and they're not sure of the long-term projections. They tend to reward size. So the bigger your business currently, I'm not saying this is right or wrong, but by and large, the biggest companies have the highest values. And so, but public comps is a starting point, but I read a lot of, I just go dig into sort of the articles, the news coverage, and then some of those banks.
We have a couple technical questions. One of the attendees has asked, does an investor invest based on the post-money valuation or the pre-money valuation?
Both. So when an investor is looking at the pre-money, what they're trying to understand is, what's the value of your business that they're contributing to. When investors think about post-money, they're usually thinking about their ownership. So if I want to own 10% of a business, and I'm willing to invest $10, well, then my post money is going to be 100, right? So they're kind of backing into that ownership. As I talked about before, there's a lot of art that goes into how people think about valuation and even structure it. I'll give you an example. There is a company called Y Combinator, which is a very famous incubator, and they shuttle each year a couple thousand companies through their process, and they have a simple agreement for future equity that essentially says they give you this much money and it's worth 10% of the company at the end. Now they do a lot of other stuff for you, but they just 10% at the end. Well, and then you're like, well, what if I've raised a lot of money? Doesn't matter, 10% at the end, right? Everyone has a different philosophy. Some people care about the ownership percentage, which they're probably more focused on the post money. If you're focused on, is this a good deal? Like, should I put my money into this or that? You're more focused on the pre-money. So it depends on the investor's approach.
We had a question, and I think it's a good one, which is, you have all this information. How do you present it to an investor in a way that will be well received? Is that a deck? Is that what? And we will have a pitch deck presentation, but can you talk about how do you package it for an investor?
I think to me the important thing, usually a pitch deck is the start. Investment is a fairly involved process, so people are going to want to get under the covers, and if they're really interested, and they're going to spend time with you, they're going to spend time with your business, your projections. So your pitch deck, and you'll go over the pitch deck. I think the key thing in the pitch deck is to make sure you touch upon those three things, right? Why is this industry, why is this particular space exciting? Why are my projections and my vision credible? And then what's exciting and why am I going to win? I think it's important to touch upon those. Most pitch decks will have their standard pieces, and you'll talk about it like industry overview, management team, valuation comps, and you're trying to lay it out there for people. How you package it, I think, depends on your investor base, right? If you're talking to someone like me, I'll take whatever you have because usually I've seen most everything, right? I look at probably, on the order of 3 presentations a day. So like if they're missing pages, it doesn't bother me. And if they're, for me, I have a certain way that I look at things. And so I'm just going to cut right to the chase. I think if you're talking to friends and family, it's about helping them feel comfortable and understanding, what's in it for them and what you're doing and understanding the big process. So I don't think there's a one size fits all. I think the important thing is when you're doing a fundraising process is to be flexible, right? You put something out there and that's your best foot forward. You always want to put your best foot forward, but you also have to be ready that if someone comes in and says, I need this, or what about this, you're able to adapt to that. So, you can talk about your pitch book, you can talk about your presentation. There's a lot of elevator pitches and things like that. It's about having those key points and nailing those key points.
We had a question here that I know you've been asked before, but I'm going to ask you again, which is how much should I raise?
Going back to sources and uses, I think it's important to think about what you want to spend money on, and how you figure that out is going to take time, right? It's not like you can ask your friends, hey, how much did you spend on your dispensary when you opened it, right? And you can't even ask your friends who do retail because it's so regulated that they're like, well, we waited till we found a building. You're like, oh, I can't do that. I have zoning issues, and this landlord knows, and this landlord, it has to be all cash. So it's actually going to be quite hard to figure out your your uses. You're going to put together a budget, and again, that's a later session. And for me, I always say for entrepreneurs, you have to be prepared for curveballs, so you should raise a little bit more. I will tell you, investors for early stage don't like to heap gobs and gobs of money onto people because there's a lot of risk, right? Because if I'm saying, if you're promising here and here, and there's 100 steps between, well, that means there's 100 opportunities for you to fail. And so investors would rather you do little bite by bite. It's not to say every day you should be coming back because fundraising is not a good use of anyone's time. But usually you want to figure out, I think for an early stage company, I'll give you one back in the envelope way of approaching it. I would think that you would want to raise for a year's worth of operations, right? Now again, it might depend. If you're doing very capital intensive things, that might be a little high, but you want to give yourself some runway that you're planning out your business and that you're able to show progress without saying to someone, hey, I want it all now, and this is the next 10 years, and you're investing all in that now. You want to be able to show people progress and let them participate in that way. So, if you were able to say, like if you went out and said, I'm going to raise 6 months worth, well then, guess what? You're probably going to start in 3 months to raise again. And that's, unless you want to be a professional fundraiser, which some people may, it's probably not a good use of time, right? So I would say, target a time horizon is one approach, another is your sources and uses. And here's the other thing, right? It's going to come down to what the market will support. I don't think anyone, for a startup business, people, even as capital intensive as marijuana can be, people are like, oh, $25 million? Sweet. It needs a little bit more credibility to structure those investments. And so think about the natural breakpoints, and that's where you should position your raise for.
I have a question, and then I'll ask. We have 2 more questions after this, but we had an earlier presentation about predatory deal making and how to watch out for people who are not interested in being good partners, investors who are not interested in being good partners. Can you talk about how one might diligence their investor?
Absolutely. So I'm a big believer in looking people in the eye and face-to-face discussion, break some bread. You want to get a feel for them. I think it's important to talk to people they've partnered with in the past, right? If they're an investor, like you would probably, if you were diligencing me, you'd want to talk to all the other companies that I've worked with, right? And you're going to ask me like, oh, I'd love to talk to some of the companies you've partnered with, and not just the ones that were successful, but some of the ones that didn't work out, right? If you're talking to people who aren't necessarily active investors, you may still want to talk to some of the other people they've worked with. So, oh, can you give me references? I think references is one of the most important things. So I'd love to meet some of the lawyers you've worked with. I'd love to meet some of the accountants you've worked with, some of your customers, right? So I think the more you can understand someone, you need in this day and age, I think there are lines to where you draw, look, I'm not beyond saying I will look at people's social media to understand, like if you're out there and, and I see you traveling the world and not actually, working, well, that goes into it, right? So I think it's the same way with an investor, right? You want to understand their footprint, understand who they are. And so referrals are the easiest way, and it will be referrals not only of the companies that and people they've invested in, but also the people they've worked with, and understanding who they are and what they do.
We have two questions from the audience, and one of them is specific, and then I want to back into this other question, which is you talked about convertible debt. And the question is, does it convert to preferred equity, common equity? Maybe you can talk a little bit about how convertible debt functions, because we see so many convertible debt deals.
Sure. So convertible debt is similar in some ways to a safe agreement, in that often on convertible debt, you're kicking the can down the road in terms of what the valuation is. So I'll talk about the specific attributes of convertible debt. Often, it's like debt. What's the interest rate? What's the maturity, right? Then there's usually some sort of triggering event that will cause the debt to flip from debt into equity. And so sometimes if it's at the investor's option, there'll be a clause that says investor's option to convert. And at that point, usually the documents will spell out what they convert into. If it's at the investor's option, right, that means your business is going like this, and the investor, even though they loaned you money, they're like, sweet, I want to participate in this. So often that's at your advantage. So, to me, from an entrepreneur's seat, if it's an optional conversion, usually it goes into common equity. That's usually the first ask as an entrepreneur, because you're like, you want to invest in me. You've already loaned me the money. I already have the money, but now my business is doing so well that you want to be a part owner. So usually that means the business is doing well. So you're looking for the most favorable to the entrepreneur, which means you're going to say, hey, optional conversion flips into common. A lot of convertible debt, the triggers will be based on what's called a qualified financing, a QF. So a lot of the mentality for convertible debt, when someone goes in and says, hey, this is what we're going to do. I'm going to invest. I don't know what the right valuation is, but let's do this. It's going to be structured as debt. And when you have someone else invest a lot, say $3 million, and that's a QF. So when someone invests $3 million, whatever the price is, boom, that's how you will value my debt, and it will convert into that equity. So in that regard, that's the nice thing of a convertible debt, is you don't have to price it right then, right? The goal is to price it later. And hopefully it's and that's why the qualified financing definition is in there. It has to be a big enough investment that you're like, oh, this is really what the market is saying your business is worth. And then I'll just ride along with whatever that is. And those are binding, right? So if I invest in a convertible note and I say a QF is $3 million, and suddenly you come in with you get a crazy valuation, I flip into that at that crazy valuation. So really the goal is, the intent is to kick the can down the road and figure that valuation. You'll hear in convertible notes, there's often something called a cap, right? So that's how investors protect themselves. So they say, well, when you raise at $3 million, I will flip into that same security, whatever it is, preferred, common, whatever's negotiated by the market. I will flip into that investment, but it can't be higher than this, right? It can't be higher than $100. So even if it comes in at $200, I'm priced at $100. So you'll hear there's a cap that investors use to protect themselves. And the other thing investors will do is sometimes they'll ask for a discount. They'll say, look, I'm putting in money now. You're going to raise money in a year. That person's going to invest at a $100 valuation. Well, I've been in for a year. Shouldn't I get a better deal? So I'm going to ask for a 20% discount. So still same thing. I'm going to flip into whatever investment they do, but I want to be I want my per share price, or my valuation to be 20% lower than whatever they're getting. And so those are usually the things that are negotiated, right? What's the QF? How big? The cap or the discount, and then the maturity. How long does this sit out there?
So there's one more question, but which is, do you have a suggestion of what a 1-year amount would be to run your business? We have a accountant who's talking next about financial modeling, but maybe you can just briefly explain how a financial model might help figure out how much you need for a year.
Yeah, no, look, I think when I think about sources and uses and I think about budgeting and projections, right? That is, though we put a lot of emphasis on that, but at the end of the day, that is putting out a plan, right? And so when you're running a business, your plan may have financial milestones, your plan may have hiring milestones, your plan may have regulatory milestones, right? Signed a lease by this date. These are all different ways of running your business. The reality is you're gonna have to do all of them. And so budgeting is just one aspect of it. And so when you're laying out that plan, it has to correlate to what your core business is, right? Because if you're saying, hey, my goal is to open this dispensary in a year, or my goal is to have my first harvest at this date, you have to be able to back into that and have that sort of plan. There's going to be an operational plan, but there's a financial plan, there's a human capital plan. All of that leads to the same thing. You're here and you're getting to here. And so the more you can communicate about that plan, the more credibility you can establish on that plan, the more likely an investor is going to believe your plan. And so budgeting is part of that plan. If you say, oh, I'm going to be able to open this dispensary and it's going to cost me $15, and people are like, it's never in history of time cost $15. Well, then that's not a very good plan. Or you have to spend a lot of energy and time convincing someone why you can do it. Again, it's about here to here and trying to help people understand the steps and the way you get there. In terms of building a budget and how much it costs, look, I think this is going to be one of these things where you're going to make assumptions and then you're going to refine those assumptions, right? It comes down to your business plan, and you're going to be doing it over and over and over again. There are no sacred cows in a business plan. You have to actually each step kind of iterate and think about it, and you're going to take data points. You're going to talk to people. So maybe it's going to be an investor, maybe it's going to be another operator, but you're going to constantly be trying to get more information to make that business plan better. And to me, the budget is just one aspect of it, right? Running a business is the goal. It's not building a perfect budget.